Hello everybody, what is up? Cobra here with a new video after a couple months now of my custom board game, the Powder Keg 1914. So, I am recording this now and you're hearing the most recent version of myself, but this game was taken about a month ago, so all of the gameplay reviews, or turn-by-turn reviews that are in this video are of course recorded a little while ago. But this recording is just because I forgot to actually include my voice in my round one review, and also I just wanted to kind of go over that I haven't been really active lately, and that's mainly just because I've been extremely busy and board gaming kind of matters have been at the kind of low priority of my life in terms of all the projects that I'm working on. So definitely hopefully maybe something in the next month about board gaming. As you can see, you know, the Powder Keg 1914 is pretty much a fully fledged game, and I think the final steps in being able to release this to you guys is basically getting down the rules. The thing is that a lot of the rules and how this game functions is still up in my head, and though there may be player aids and a full map, that really just helps with gameplay sessions and not really being able to give this to random people that aren't in my playing group, because I kind of know everything right now in my head and not actually something that I can just pass off to people at the time being. But I really want to get this game out, not only for you guys but also for myself. I've been working on this game for far too long, and I really want to express my creativity elsewhere. And this game, especially at its height of when I was trying to get it out, it was taking a huge swath of my life. So definitely, hopefully, by summer, early summer, midsummer, I can get this thing to somebody who is willing to sell it, and then mainly you guys can pick this up and play it with your friends. I think it's one of the most fun board games I've played. It's definitely up there with the original Axis and Allies 1914 Global, or 1940 Global Pacific in Europe, one of my original favorites, and also games like, or third-party games like Sired Blood's 1940, and also Historical Board Gaming's 1936. So, and I've spent half of my life probably studying World War I just as a hobby. I love the time period, and I think that there really wasn't games out there that were really fun and also captured the history and just the context of the craziness that went down during those intense 4 years of conflict and political intrigue across the world. So, getting into the gameplay review, you can see a few things have happened so far, but I'll be getting into like what actually went on during this first round of gameplay. So first up, as you can see here, we're just starting over in the Americas. Now, if you've watched my other videos in the playlist that I've made called Learning the Powder Keg, you'll see that all the powers get to set up their units individually. And I guess I'll also go over that this is the end of 1914. There's only one round of 1914, the last half, and then you go into 1915. So this is the beginning of 1915 now. So as you can see, the Americans have not really done much. They can't really do too much other than kind of infringe on some neutrality of their neighbors. But you can see they just kind of piled up some forces on the Spanish or the Mexican-American border. Bigger events happened, which was Colombia declaring war on America and invading Panama, which was a random event card that got pulled. So you can see there that the Colombian Expeditionary Force took Panama pretty quickly, and now is allowing Central Powers warships to pass through. So you can see there's a German destroyer in the Caribbean, and the Americans definitely want to take that back because it's a pretty big prestige thing, and also the fact that Panama contains a victory city. And though the Americans are still out of the war, the Colombians are not only at war with the Americans, but are also Central Powers aligned. Another thing that happened was that the British are trying to play the game very diplomatically, and they have a few options in terms of getting neutrals to swing one way or the other, and they ended up sending the Chilean Navy a pre-dreadnought and that allowed them to not swing closer to the Central Powers. There was a naval battle off of the French Polynesia, and a French gunboat was destroyed by the German cruiser down there in the south. German commerce raiders are kind of spread all over the world. You can see there with the German ship in the top of the screen, and also another random event card, a Haitian rebellion broke out, and basically they are hostile against the Americans. They can't really do anything on their island, but they will join or align themselves with Mexico if the Americans don't quash them, which means that a powerful Mexico might be harder for the U.S. to take on in the future. Over here in Europe, a good amount of stuff has gone on. The Germans are trying to, which I'm playing, are trying to play pretty diplomatically. They decided not to go through Belgium, and instead they went through the Maginot Line. But you can see that they're in Germany right now, and that is because the French pushed them back out. The Germans were not able to take the line, and so now they are rallying their forces for an early 1915 push back into the Maginot, and hopefully to start threatening some of the French interior territories. The great part of this game, the great piece of combat system that I really like, is the fact that you are really not guaranteed to take territories. The way the system works, a lot of the times you fight around and then you're just pushed back to where you came from, similar to the real conflict. The Germans also decided not to go through Belgium and keep the British out of the war. If nobody declares war on Belgium, Britain can stay out of the war for a good 2 rounds or so. Over here in the east, the Germans, because they piled so much against France, had very little to defend against the Russians, and the Russian army is spread thin but strong across their entire front line. You can see that they didn't really do much against the Austro-Hungarians, and that is because the Central Powers cut a deal with the Russians that they would not try and align the Ottoman Empire if the Russians did not attack them. So you can see that the Russian army has remained at a halt, except for the fact that you can see too that the Germans are planning an offensive into Western Poland over there. But they, of course, don't have a ton of units, so we'll see how that works out in the end. And also, if they do break their little temporary truce with the Russians, you can see that Königsberg up in the north is very poorly defended against the Russians based out of the Baltic states. Getting to the southern theater of the war, the place where this all started, Serbia, you can see that the Austro-Hungarians have kind of conquered their way through northern Serbia and Montenegro pretty easily, but they're faced with an issue. The fact that they didn't send too many forces down there. You can see most of their forces are still in Bosnia, but the Serbian army has retreated to the mountains down south, and that basically makes this very difficult for the Austrians to have to come down, commit more forces further south to crush those Serbians. Plus, being in the mountains makes them very strong. Also, everybody's trying to swing the Ottoman Empire one way or the other, so you can see that they have received a dreadnought and a pre-dreadnought from the Germans and British. The Germans have evacuated Tsingtao. They just don't feel like the resistance would be much of a thorn in the side of the Japanese, so they instead railed their forces through neutral China into German Hankow to kind of hang out and face off against the British in that little city concession. And that is because the Germans have a plan, and that plan is to establish an army of the Southeast Asia. And how they did that, or plan to do that, is taking their forces from East Asia, you can see those 2 cruisers, and launch an amphibious assault against Vietnam. Now, they tried once and failed. They actually lost a cruiser to French shore guns, but they're going to try again. As you can see, they only have 1 Marine detachment left, and of course this little play has definitely left them very weak in the south, as they've pretty much evacuated all of their Southeast Asian islands. Not much is going on in China as usual. It's just a big neutral country that nothing really happens in until a little civil war breaks out, and even at that point it's just kind of a swing back and forth between two powers, and not to. It's very difficult to win the war. It's more of just something that kind of happened in the background. Over here in France, the Zion Confederation has fallen, so the Central Powers are now out of North Africa. Now, of course, the British are not in the war yet, so the Germans have not attacked them down here in the south, so Africa remains pretty silent, except for a few Germans that are in the West African sphere that are trying to invade a few French territories. All right, well, my past self will jump back in for the recaps from now on, starting with the first half of 1915, but I hope this little beginning intro and this video gives you a little bit more interest in this game, and definitely hope to see you guys again in the next one. Cobra, out. Alright, it is now the start of round 3, and you can see that after the events of the first round of 1915, there's been a lot of changes to the map. So starting over here in the Americas, you can see that the Americans have launched an unsuccessful attack against the Colombian oppressors of Panama. They did only lose an infantry unit, so they still have a cavalry loaded on a transport, and they did destroy the entire Panamanian invasion force with their battleship bombardment. So next turn, and plus they're blockading the sea zone, so Colombia was not able to reinforce their holding. So now the Americans are likely primed to take back Panama, and while America is still neutral, Colombia has joined the Central Powers, so taking Panama will not only take back the canal, but also the important victory city of Panama City. In other news, up north, the Haitians have rebelled against American influence, and so now the Americans have had an ultimatum put by a random event card. Now they weren't able to attack it this turn, and if they don't in this next turn, the Haitians will join with Mexico and form an anti-American bloc, basically. So you can see here that the Haitian army has been mobilized. You have an infantry and a gunboat, a measly force, but something that the Americans have to deal with their small peacetime army. And up north, the Americans, with their limited income, haven't done too much. They did build a Zeppelin, which is quite interesting, that they'll be able to use to bombard their Caribbean enemies, and another transport to help reinforce those. Swinging over to the African continent, not too much has happened, especially because Britain has not, didn't declare war this turn, but will now be going to war. Or now every nation except for America is at war. So you can see here that the Germans have marched out of Togo to over here in Dahomey. That's basically just to threaten the British in Nigeria. They thought that that would be a bigger threat. You can see that they're also making retreats across the board just in anticipation for the British. The Cameroonian Defense Force is moving into the African interior. The forces in southern Africa are basically spreading out. German cavalry are probably going to go try and rush for Rhodesia just to spread the British army a little more thin. And the Germans in East Africa are likely to be evacuating soon. Now, the Ethiopians in Dervish State did pick sides, so you can see here that Ethiopia has joined the French army, and the Dervish State down here has also joined the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire still is not in the war, and they are still a little bit away, probably another turn or two away from joining the Central Alliance if the Central Alliance rolls for them. They have been rolling for Italy for the past couple turns, and right now they are primed to likely grab Italy to join their side, so looking to be a pretty interesting war. In other events, the German funded Sultanate of Oman has just been kind of chilling out here. The British have just been blockading them in place, and they're likely to sweep this up, but it definitely has drawn British forces to help try and hold this territory, their southern Arabian holdings. And also, not much has happened in the South Seas as Britain hasn't been at war with Germany, but now they are likely primed to take over an empty German southern colonial holdings. And the reason that those are empty is because the Germans and their East African fleet went for an invasion of French Indochina, viewing that as a priority target. And while they took a cruiser and a transport as losses because you can see the Russian Siberian fleet came down and took them out, the Germans, and I'm playing the Germans, I view this as a pretty decent strategic objective, because not only have I now captured a major port, an IPP, or a war material off the French, I also have a victory city, plus a rail network. And so basically what my strategy is to bring forces from China down to Indochina, building a land army, and then trying to threaten British India. So we'll see how that works out. The East Asian Squadron, after supporting the landings there, has basically spread out across the Indian Ocean. You can see that we've got German destroyer there, a German cruiser off the coast of Africa. We've got other German cruisers there. There's a small German flotilla off the coast of Chile. And we have an Austro-Hungarian cruiser and German gunboat raiding off of India. The Americans invaded the Sultanate of Sulu in unopposed battle, and they just wanted to control that, make sure that they're not threatened in the Philippines anytime soon. With Britain joining the war, the Japanese also joined the conflict. And moving to major events in Europe. So first off, I guess starting in the Balkans, as that's where the conflict started, the Austrians have basically not made too much gains. They pushed into Serbia, and you can see that they've basically formed a defensive line outside of Skopje, down here in the south. The Serbian army is still quite strong, and especially when they're held up in the mountains, it will be a tough nut to crack for the Austrians. Down here, for the start of the latter half of 1915, you can see that the Greeks have gone into civil war and picked sides. So you can see here that the territories with Greek flags, so you have the Greek capital, the island of Corfu, and a small Greek expeditionary force that landed in the Ottoman-controlled territory of Myce, have all joined the Central Alliance, as well as the Greek Navy, which you can see is quite strong because the US actually sold them a dreadnought, and they're probably regretting that now, considering that that has fallen into an opposing alliance. The other territories you can see have aligned with the French, and a small Greek counter-revolutionary army here is held up in Macedonia. That is a pretty important position, considering that now the Serbians can be supported, although naval superiority is likely to fall into the Central Alliance hands, considering that the Greek and Austrian navy are now combined. The Austrians were able to launch an assault against the French navy, although they were the losers of the battle, losing a couple ships, and the French losing nothing. You can see they just took those hits on their dreadnoughts, very powerful units in this game. The Russians have been playing pretty great during this game, especially considering the German and Austro-Hungarian shortcomings. So we can see here that basically at the end of round 1915, the Russians had pushed into Bukovina, Galicia, and the Austrians were just barely able to take back one of those territories. You can see that they built a very spread out, thinly defended front line, likely to push back into Galicia. But these Russian artillery definitely did their job in spreading Austro-Hungarian forces quite thin. But those Russian artillery are likely to fall back, considering that they don't want to be lost to a superior Austrian force. The Germans have been in kind of dire straits because of the Russians. You can see that basically for the past 2 turns, the Russians have been basically at the gates of the German home country. And at the end of 1915, you can see that they now control East and West Prussia, east of this river line here. And that gives them a huge advantage here, considering that they have a river and a city to help bolster their defense is basically integrating these into the wider Russian front. The Germans, you can see too, are pretty weak over on this side of the board, and you'll see even weaker in the west. So they've been just giving it their all to hold back the Russian offensive. You can see that I do have some spoiling attacks here planned out, so hopefully we'll see either if these attacks go great, I'll probably buy myself a couple more turns, but if they go poorly, I definitely predict that Russia will be at the gates of Berlin next turn. Hopefully from there I'll be able to push them back, but if not, we could see a short end of the game. Okay, but in the west you can see that there is not a lot of forces to be mentioned. So, as you saw in last turn, the Germans were pushed out of the Maginot Line. You can see I've since recaptured it, destroying the entire French army there. So that was a pretty major victory, and you can see that the French are practically non-existent except for a few massive stacks of artillery here and there. The German army, as I have right now, I was considering going, I have a few mobile units. Basically, that was my plan, is that right now I'm so weak that I don't have the economy to build a giant stack of infantry and, a big stack of an army to start marching turn by turn to Paris. So, considering I had a motorized unit with some artillery to tow, I decided to build this large force of armored trains. So you can see here that these armored trains will be able to carry these armies across the board, basically wherever I wanted. And my plan was to hit Prés de Calais up here and try and block off British reinforcements from coming in. But you can see that my strategic goal now, that France is so weak and Italy is so close to joining, is basically to push south, and then hopefully, if the Italians join, link up with the Italians and form a basically southern front line where I can push up towards Paris, because in this game, kind of getting ahead of yourself and making strategic blunders can really just lead to your defeat. And for example, if that armored train force plus this artillery had come up to Prés de Calais and taken it, it is highly likely that the French would have come in here, basically surrounding me, and the British could have launched an amphibious assault and basically annihilated my army, and really probably led to me likely losing the game. That probably would have been a losing move, considering that my entire Western Front army would have been annihilated. But with an Italian entry into the war, I'll likely be pulling German forces out of France to help with the Russian catastrophe in the east, and basically leaving France to the Italians. The British have largely pulled out of the Mediterranean to come up here and oppose the German fleet, so you can see that the British fleet is heavily in favor of just eliminating the German fleet as a threat. So hopefully, as the Germans, that won't happen, because that will invite landings up here. This is a pretty nicely defended zone, not only considering the warships, but it also is defended by minefields, and Germany recently got advanced minefields. So hopefully we'll see no British invasions, although it is highly likely. Coming over real quick to finish out this recap, we can see here that there is a decent spread of technologies, with Britain and France possessing super zeppelins of all things. A lot of countries have now researched spotting craft, and Germany does have in-depth coastal defense. With round 3 opening up, you can see that there are new techs to be researched, and a couple more freebies that have been given to Britain and France. On the morale track, by losing those home territories, you can see that the Austro-Hungarians have fallen quite close to their first negative modifier to morale, that being their forces' refusal to attack, but they are not quite there yet. So hopefully in the next turn they'll be able to recover that morale. And on the diplomacy board, you can see that not much has changed, except for the fact that the Central Powers do have Italy in a locked position, so the Allies cannot drag Italy back. The Allies do have their own Italian tracker, and that is also quite close to joining, but if Germany can nail the diplomacy role and get Italy to join, that will be it for the alignment of Italy. Other than that, there is not much else to say. The Central Powers are currently winning with 21 victory points out of the 20 they need, but it is quite likely that that will fall with further assaults into the German homeland. Hopefully not, but we'll have to see. Other than that, Britain is at war, America's inching closer to war, and we will see what happens at the end of round 3. Alright everybody, so it is now the start of 1916, so 1915 has concluded, and like usual, we'll just start over here in America. You can see that the Americans have been slowly building up, getting closer to war, and they've gone heavy into investing into some pretty big units, some siege artillery, and a air fleet of Zeppelins to help out in their Caribbean conquest. And they have been having a little bit of lack of success down here. You can see the Colombians still control Panama, even though they don't have any units there. There was a Haitian rebellion, as you saw last turn. The Americans were unable to defeat them in time, and now that Haitian army has joined or aligned itself with Mexico. Mexico is still neutral, but definitely something the Americans will have to watch out for. The Cubans also, via random event card, have now risen up against the Americans and their influence. So there is now again a race, sort of like with Haiti, where the Americans will try and crush Cuba before the Cubans can align themselves with Mexico. Over here, a German POW ship was liberated, and now they are ready to set sail. So right now you just have a German transport with an infantry, likely to maybe attack somewhere in Ireland next turn. German cruiser squadrons are all over the Pacific and Atlantic. You can see here a small fleet based out of Chile and cruisers all along the African coast. Over here in Africa, the French fleet of the Mediterranean has pulled back to Algiers. The Germans are surrounded in Togoland. The British are advancing into Cameroon. Not much has happened in South Africa except for a German assault on Rhodesia. And over here, the Dervish state and Ethiopia have picked sides. So you can see that the Dervish people have aligned themselves with Germany and invaded Kenya to help support the Germans in East Africa. And the Ethiopians are kind of standing around making sure that the Derbs can't get up to Egypt. The Ottomans are still neutral during the war, not likely to align with anyone soon, but Italy has been on the verge of joining both sides for the past 2 rounds, and still nothing. So hopefully Germany can align them this turn, because if not, the Central Powers will likely be in a losing state, considering that Austria-Hungary ceded a lot of their territory to try and get Italy to join the Central Alliance. You can see the British are still surrounding the Imamate of Oman, which has aligned itself with Germany. There is a German cruiser in the Red Sea, and the Greek Civil War is nearly concluded with a few democratic Greek holdouts in the Aegean and Crete, but otherwise you can see that the Greek army and navy has consolidated in off the coast of Athens, and that is why the French have kind of pulled back, because right now naval superiority is definitely in the Austrians' favor. Austria did strike a deal with the Russians and pulled back out of Kosovo into Belgrade if the Russians did not attack along the Austrian border. That end of the deal is fulfilled now, so we'll see if the Serbians decide to come out of their mountain hideout to face the Austrians. Over here, in the Pacific, not a lot of combat has happened or actual fighting. The Australians have a Zeppelin down there and have taken out most of the German South Asian Mandate, along with the Samoan Islands. Japan has come down and taken the Caroline Islands. The German army down here in Vietnam is still kind of marching around, raiding territories, and the British Indian Army is pinned down, trying to crush those Germans over there. with some support from Russian fleet assets. There was an uprising in Taiwan, and now Taiwan is controlled by Germany, a pretty nice prize for them. And the Chinese Civil War has started. You can see here that the Southern Democratic, the Southern Democratic Liberation Front is now opened, and they are trying to oppose the Allied aligned North, and this Southern movement is aligned with Germany. Over here in Japan, Japan has fully committed itself to the Allied war effort, so they are likely to start sending forces. They've already taken Sing Sao last turn. And over here in Europe, where most of the action is taking place, we have a lot of things that happened last turn. So the Germans were able to retake Königsberg, as you can see there, and the Russians took back Western Poland, but the Austrians did end up coming into southern Poland there. You can see that we're basically sitting in stalemate right now as it stands. The Germans have dug in, as well as the Russians, although it's likely that combat will occur next turn. As the Germans, I'm definitely trying to figure out what to do about this situation. I would really like the Russians to be kicked out of Königsberg, or out of West Prussia down here, but also this is a pretty major army over here in Poland, and if I could push in there, it would really shorten up the front line, being that I would only have to defend these 3 territories rather than all 4 of these territories you can see here. Other than that, the Russians are in a pretty good state. They are a little weak down here in the south, but they will get to go before the Austrians and try and shore up those lines down there. The Austrians, even after ceding territories to the Italians and not having great success in Serbia, have been doing pretty good. They pushed back the Russian invasion of their homeland and now have quite the powerful armies sitting on the Russian border. The British fleet has pretty much fully blockaded the German fleet in port, although the Germans can still escape via the Kiel Canal, or the Kaiser Wilhelm Canal. But they are greatly defended right here with an advanced minefield to help keep them safe. So in France, unlike the Eastern Front, the Germans really haven't had a lot of forces to work with here, as their armies have just been getting wiped out by the French, although the French don't have a lot to work with either, so it's really just small skirmishes occurring right now. You can see that the Germans did try to cut down to Savoy to try and reach the Mediterranean and maybe link up with a central-powered Italy, but that never came to fruition, and the French were able to push them out. Definitely the game hangs in the balance of Italy. If the Germans can ally the Italians will likely kind of help out the Germans and secure the French front, but if the Italians join the Allies, I would say the Central Powers is pretty well and truly doomed. The fact that Austria-Hungary is so weak over here, and the Italians will pretty easily be able to try and make a run for the Austrian mainland, or heartland here with their twin capitals. The Germans have been, with the little forces I have, been able to put up a decent fight. You can see I've pretty well secured the Maginot Line here. The French really don't have enough forces to retake it decisively, and I launched a small assault into the Meuse-Argonne from Luxembourg, and that's basically just to steal some money from the French and divert forces, because the British Expeditionary Force, which you can see here, quite large, has just arrived, and they're going to have to face this little picket force here before they can really push the German drive down here in the center. And definitely the reinforcements that you can see here, they're either going to move up this turn if the Italians don't join, but if the Italians do join the Central Alliance, those forces will be able to pull back to the east and allow the Italians to come in. So that is just about all that has happened around the globe, and definitely the Central Alliance has been in a pretty dire state since the beginning of this game, but there are a few things that could really swing the tide, such as Italy and some other assaults around the globe, seeing if those pull off and divert Allied resources. But I'll have to see you in the next round of the latter half of 1916. Alright everybody, it is now the end of 1916, and I'm probably going to be calling this game now. Most of my players have retired from playing the game, and we've basically been kind of dug into what we deemed an eventuality that the Allies would win this game. So, like I said, it is the end of 1916. The British have made their turn, but you can see that in the last turn, the Russians were able to push into Pomerania and recapture a lot of their territory that was lost to them. The German fleet took out the Russians, but they are trapped in Russian minefields right now. You can see all these German stacks on the border because they were frantically placing down infantry to defend their territories after a British invasion took Schleswig-Holstein and the Kaiser Wilhelm Canal. And those forces then went on to try and take Berlin, which they inflicted heavy losses on the Germans but weren't able to take it. Although a big reason we called this is that while the Central Powers is seeing a little bit of success, say in the Mediterranean with Italy joining their forces this turn, the fact that the Allies can put all their efforts to Berlin and the Germans don't really have the gains to reinforce Berlin means that it's likely that in the next turn or the turn after that, Berlin will likely fall. And while that doesn't mean a German surrender is guaranteed, that would be a huge blow to Germany and likely see to it that they end up surrendering. The British maintain their blockade over Germany, and you can see down here that the Americans have also joined the war. They've sent their air force over here as well as an expeditionary force in the south. The British, or the VEF, has pushed the Germans down, and now the Germans have pulled only over the Maginot Line. The Austro-Hungarians and Italians came down into the south, which they hold pretty heavily considering that the Allies don't have much to try and retake it, but all they really need to do is crush the Germans and then divert forces down south. The Serbian army has retreated from Serbia into Greece. They likely will be able to capture many Greek territories before Austro-Hungarians can get down there, and with the British East Asian fleet coming up, it's likely that they will be able to reinforce the Serbians. Over here, the Americans, like I said, have joined the war. Most of their forces have been deployed to Europe. The French fleet has come down here and taken out a small German task force. The Austro-Hungarian and Italian fleets are sitting in port right now. While they are strong, the British are likely to come in and mop up the floor with them, meaning that those will likely be gone, being large morale losses to both those powers, and Italy really doesn't have the economy to defend their home territories from a full-on Allied invasion, which you can see building over here in India with a combined British and Japanese force, which is based out of Colombo, Ceylon, and will likely come up through the Red Sea. You can see that the Austro-Hungarians and Italians don't really have the forces to threaten the Suez Canal, and the Germans are pretty much, while they haven't lost much of their territory in the South African region, you can see holding those territories there, as well as still holding Dar es Salaam in the East African region. The British have landed in Zanzibar and are preparing an attack. The Italians are a nice boost to the Central Powered forces, but the British are definitely bringing down the hammer in the region. Over here, the Germans, which have been doing their job threatening the Southeast Asian region for this entire game, have not really completed their task of forming an army of Southeast Asia, which was supposed to march on India. It definitely kind of fizzled out and was contained up there in the Tonkin region of Vietnam. And the Chinese Civil War just started, but it's not likely much will change in terms of victory conditions in that region. It's kind of interesting, the Ottomans are, if they were to be aligned would be quite the powerful nation, considering that nations have been lend-leasing them ships and artillery pieces to try and get them to join either side. And the Ottomans are pretty close to joining the Central Powers. They would likely join it in the next 1 or 2 turns, but as I said, if Germany surrenders, the game is finished, meaning that the Allies, in this case with such a weak Germany, would likely be able to get to Berlin and take out the other German cities and annihilate a couple armies to eliminate their morale. So I definitely think this was a really fun game. This definitely showed, in comparison to the last game, if you followed with my YouTube Shorts series, that the different ways that this game can go. In that series, Germany and Austria-Hungary pretty much blew through Serbia and Belgium in round 1 and secured themselves a major, success early on in Europe, allowing them to eventually force their way into all of France and cause the Russian Civil War. And they were so powerful at that stage that even as British landings were taking place and taking most of Germany and actually surrounding Berlin at one point, they still were not able to take enough victory objectives away from the Central Powers. In that game too, Spain ended up joining the Central Powers with the Ottomans, and even Italy joined the Allies but was not able to hold back the Austro-Hungarians. In this game though, the Germans decided to try a more diplomatic route, going into France through the Maginot Line, which was much more heavily defended, rather than Belgium. You can see Belgium is still neutral up there. And they relied on a few tactics like making some diplomacy with the Russians to not attack them outright, while going for Italy rather than the more easily acquired Ottoman Empire. I definitely think that going all out for Italy early on as the Central Powers is definitely not the way to go. To try and maybe pick up some of the nations that are closer to you. Italy is a huge threat to the Allies if it joins the Central Powers, but what happened in this game is once the Central Powers started going for Italy, the Allies tried to counter that by also going for Italy, and then it was basically a stalemate. And in that time, the Central Powers likely could have devoted their efforts towards influencing the Ottomans, the Bulgarians, and even the Greeks. So overall, I definitely enjoyed this game, and I hope to see more in the future. I've got a couple more projects coming out, and I hope you guys will enjoy those. Cobra, out.